I got some remarks written down here. First, I want to thank the Indiana Sportswriters and Sportscasters Association for making this possible. It just so turns out that I am the number 4 hitter today. And it's great that everybody hit a home run, because if anybody saw me play ball, I wasn't going to drive in as a cleanup hitter anyway, so it works out just fine. I want to talk about gratitude. You know, my heart is full of gratitude today. You know, I'm thankful for the opportunities I've had. I'm thankful that I get to share this day with Conrad, Mark, and Tim, Tom, and Larry, and Todd, Mark, and John, and Paul, and everybody here that is here to celebrate. I'm grateful that my friends and family get to be here with me. My parents, Don and Lois Krah, they've been my biggest supporters. We lost Dad almost 13 years ago, but I'm glad that my mother is here, Lois, my sister, Lisa Whiteman. I got several other friends that are here. Bill Beck, Tim Creason, Melanie Creason. Bob Mitchell's come from New York. Robert Mitchell and Sarah Mitchell have come from Pennsylvania. Howard Greniger came from Terre Haute. Ray Kime, I know him as Rocky, known him since I was 5 years old. He's here. Rick Martinez, Pete Cavett, Reed Duffy. I think that covers everybody that I knew that was coming. And I've learned that the 2 words, thank you, can go a long way. I remember that Bill Beck told me in the early days that we worked together that he kept a file of thank you. And he would take that file out every once in a while when things weren't going right. Somebody was chewing his ear on the phone, pull that out. Yeah, somebody liked him that day. Made him feel better. I started doing the same thing, and I still do that. You know, one of my favorite writers is Dave Kindred. He wrote a long time for the the Sporting News, and he writes golf now. And I marveled at the way he could take 2 subjects that didn't seem to have anything to do with each other and blend them together. Jeff Gillespie was a newspaper man for 50 years, and he was the managing editor at the Elkhart Truth when I started there. And he wrote a column called Nearly Delirious, and he would always have a stream of semi-consciousness part of his column. Well, I've been told by people that I've interviewed that I spray around my questions, so I'll try not to lose you with some of my other observations here. Paul Condry. I've heard him say more than once that famous quote that Jimmy Cannon, the New York City sportswriter, said that this is sports is the toy department of life. I agree with that. Sports is just a game. We know that it intersects with life, and it gives us the opportunity to mix the 2 together, and sports can be serious. But when you think about it, it really is a diversion, and I like that. As a writer, as a reporter, as a broadcaster, you get to be the eyes and the ears for people who maybe they're not at the game. They don't get to go in the locker room like you do. They don't get to go to cover the Colts in New England like you do. You bring the scene to them. That's kind of what I see my chances as a sports writer, or just a writer in general. I've always said that everybody has a story, and you just need to know what it is. So you got to ask the right questions, talk to the right people. Remember the scene from Field of Dreams? I'm sure most of the people in this room have seen the movie Field of Dreams. Remember when the old players were invited to come into the corn, and Terrence Mann, that was James Earl Jones's character, and he invited Ray Kinsella, that's Kevin Costner, and Ray says, "Are you going to write about it?" And Terrence says, that's what I do. I can agree with that. I can identify with that. I started thinking of myself as a writer, I think, back in elementary school when teachers supported the idea that I would write, turn in a book report. Well, I think I'll write it about sports, and they let me get away with that. So, that made writing fun for me. I remember in middle school, I would write these 5-paragraph stories, and 2 of my buddies would say, can you put my byline on there too, because I'll get credit. I can tell you who they are too. One of them was Rob Kamiak, who ended up playing basketball at Ball State, and the other one was Steve Krieg. So anyways, Tom Sumsky, he was my teacher in elementary school, and he gave me that early instruction, and I don't know where Tom is now, but I thank him. Leonard Beachy did much the same for me when I was in high school. I went to Northridge High School in Middlebury, Elkhart County. He helped me get a job at the Middlebury Independent, covering sports there during my junior year in high school, and we got the school paper up and running again when I was a senior. Enjoyed that. Julie Barth and Judy Hughes were my editors over the years at the Independent, and I thank them. I went to Ball State, worked at the Daily News for 3 years. I worked with Mike Bias, who most people will know. He's very famed right here in this community. He writes for the local paper here and has for several other publications. Was my sports editor, John Ketzenberger, who you've probably seen on TV and in publications for years. Was the assistant sports editor, and Earl Yestingsmeyer was the SID there. And I learned many things from those gentlemen. That's also where I wrote my first column under the sports season tickets banner, and I've written several since then. And at Ball State, I also got a chance to meet a gentleman named Ron LeMasters. I know that Paul got the award named after him today, and I had a chance to be a stringer for the Muncie Star when I was in. I mean, what a great guy. Just always had a smile on his face. He was a great journalist too. I can still see him strolling into the arena with a box of popcorn in his hand, and everybody knew who he was, and I mean he was just in his element. When I was in school, particularly at Ball State, I learned some sports writing tips. First of all, when you're interviewing, you go talk to the visiting coach and players first, because they have a bus to catch. And you don't assume that the reader knows the sport or the final score. You get that high in the story. I've read many a story where the final score or the sport was not even in the story. So just because the header says basketball, or it's on the same page as a bunch of basketball stories, doesn't necessarily mean, and especially in this day and age, they may not be looking at the actual newspaper, so don't take that for granted. My first job out of college was at the Brazil Times. Jim Dressler hired me there, and I spent some long days and built friendships with Bob Mitchell, Howard Greninger, and they're over here today. Paula Mitchell, who is now Bob's wife, she was in Brazil too at the time. She's a fine journalist and has been a friend for many years. She just started her own business and is super busy. Speaking of the business has really changed since, quote, the early days. The deadlines have gotten tighter. News holes have gotten smaller, and so have the staffs. Bill mentioned that. That's certainly the case. I worked before the hot lead era, but I worked with some people who talked about hot lead and the type. But I was exposed to VDTs, that's video display terminals, pasting up the paper with hot wax and an X-Acto knife. I got to see that. I didn't know anything about what pagination was back then. The internet had not yet been invented. and there was no such thing as blogging. What would social media be? Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Those are all down the road. You know what those are now. Brief time I was in Zanesville, Ohio, I got to tell a lot of stories in a short period of time, thanks to sports editor Sherry Dinan, and then when I was there, Dave Whiting took over the position. And I thank those gentlemen. Dennis Kraft, he was my first sports editor at the Elkhart Truth, and he was followed by Rick Meyer and then Bill Beck. I soaked up wisdom from managing editors like Jeff Gillespie, Bill Wilson, Terry Greenberg, Greg Halling. I had many colleagues and friends in 25 plus years. I can't mention everybody, but some of those: Anthony Anderson, Terry Mark, Earl Mishler, Ken Fox, Tony Wontuck, Marshall King, Jim Miller, Arden Erickson, Ryan Martin, Deb Sprong, Dan Spalding. Anthony was the assistant sports editor, later became the sports editor. Terry, for a time, was in the sports department. Earl in the sports department. Ken. Most of those other people were in the newsroom. It's all a team. It's just because you work in sports doesn't mean you don't work with those other people or get to know them. It was funny that when I would go out in public to wherever, and they'd think, well, you're the baseball writer, or you're the wrestling guy, or whatever. And I said to myself, well, yeah, you know me as that. But I figured out one time I'd written like 60 different sports, at least once. So that was the variety. That was fun. We had a roundtable column that we would occasionally write at the paper. And for a time, I wrote Duffy Mulligan. And guess what that was about? At the golf course here. And I got a former editor that still addresses me as Duffy. He doesn't call me Steve. He never did drop that. I've been fortunate to work with the people at Regional Radio, Sports Network, Indiana Football Digest, Primetime Publications. I have those people in my life. Thanks to Paul Condry, Tiny Condry, Matt Copsey, Donnie Smith, Dalton Shetler, J.P. Gilbert, and all the current and former members of that fine RSN team. As an independent contractor, I've got the good fortune of working with some of these people. Bill Belinsky at the South Bend Tribune, Stephen Brooks and Greg Kime at the Goshen News, Dale Hubler at the Warsaw Times Union, Scott Novak at Leader Publications, which is in Lower Michigan, Joe Caprino at Indiana Mat, which is a wrestling website, Phil Wade at Prep Baseball Report Indiana, another fine website. I've met so many people in this business that you're side by side and you're covering the same things they are, or you pass them, or you get encouragement. I just want to mention a few. Tim Creason, he's here today. Stu Schwartz, Scott Davidson, Kenny Peterson, Chuck Freeby, Al Lessar, Brian Miller, Don Wagner, Vince Turner, Paul Beitler, Jim Hopkins, Brent Hess, Reggie Hayes, Reggie's here today, Greg Jones, Jim Peters. I can go on and on and on, but those are some of the people that I wanted to mention. Over the years, I've met so many friends in athletic departments, the ADs, the secretaries. You get to know who will help you with what information, and you go to that person first. That might be the assistant AD, that might be the secretary. You get to know them, they know you. Sometimes they're probably sick of hearing my voice on the phone. Is this, we rained out again today for the third, day in a row. But they're very helpful. It's a good professional relationship. You also get to know the umpires, the referees, and starters on a first name basis. I thank all of those people. I think of all the places I filed a story. I think of dictating stories from a phone booth. I mean, Bill's been on the other end of that before. I think Bob probably, or Howard probably has been, I'm sure, back when there were phone booths. Remember those? As recently as last football season, I sat in a weight room